So, just how serious is the threat from China in our region? That's the question of the age. What exactly is it that's prompted the US to now share with Australia technology that it's only ever shared before with Britain? I took up these issues with Captain James Fanell, a 30-year US Navy intelligence veteran, now with the Geneva Centre for Security Policy.
Well, Chris, first, thanks for having me on. I think it's very significant, as you allude to, in terms of just the sharing of the nuclear technology. It's something that, as you mentioned, has only been shared with the United Kingdom from the United States. And having served in the U.S. Navy and worked around nuclear submarine operations and plans and such, it's very sensitive and things that we would never, ever share unless it was that serious. And so I think it's a reflection of the threat that the People's Republic of China is placing on the region and directly on Australia. You'll be interested to note that last night, China Daily or Global Times noted that that this deal was basically Australia planting a time bomb for regional peace and security, and was very pointed in threatening Australia because of this deal. I think that's a reflection of a China that's expanding and already threatening Australia, and they're going to use this deal now to increase the rhetoric. But clearly, this agreement signals how strong the U.S., Australia, and U.K. alliance is, and that people aren't going to sit by any longer and watch Xi and the Chinese Communist Party basically operate without the world reacting to them.
Well, this is where I want to get your insight as to what's changed in recent years, because, of course, nuclear-propelled submarines have been the best submarines for 75 years. Australia's been fiddling around with domestically built diesel-powered, diesel-electric submarines. Obviously, it would have been in our interest to have nuclear submarines earlier, but we've made this quantum leap now, obviously with the support of the US and the UK. How drastically has that threat of China emerged in the last few years to push such a significant development?
Well, I like to tell people, if you go back 20 years ago and you looked at the Chinese Navy, it was operating essentially within their coastal region, within 20, 30 miles of their coast, and rarely, if ever, would send a ship beyond the first island chain. And today, the Chinese Navy is operating daily the most dominant force inside the first island chain, but also now the dominant force outside the first island chain in those water space between Okinawa and Guam. You've had Chinese warships and probably even submarines operating off your coast over the last few years. They're expanding into the waters through the Solomon Islands, through Kiribati. They're going down to South America. They're going into the Indian Ocean. So China's naval expansion has just been dramatic. The single largest naval buildup since World War II has been by the People's Republic of China. And that's combined with the growth of their strategic rocket force, the growth of their Air Force, the growth of their cyber forces, and other things that all are hard power, along with their economic growth with the Belt and Road and putting tentacles into Europe and into Africa and into Latin America.
Now, it's going to take a long while for Australia to build its own nuclear-propelled submarines, but of course it's even going to take quite a few years before we get to have the Virginia-class submarines from the US. Tell us, in the interim, how much security is delivered to Australia by having more frequent visits from US in particular, but also UK nuclear-powered submarines into our regions and based from time to time in our ports?
Well, I think what it will do is it'll provide access for more U.S. Navy Pacific Fleet and Atlantic Fleet nuclear submarines that'll be able to operate from Australia instead of having to wait for them to come from the west coast of the United States or the east coast. So it'll put us in theater, if you will. It's still a bit of a ways from Australia into the first island chain, the South China Sea, if you will, but it makes us closer and cuts down the time to get to the area. It also allows us to provide another threat vector for the Chinese to consider, which is they've traditionally just thought about stuff coming from Hawaii or Guam or the West Coast. Now they're going to have to consider things from the south, and that just makes their planning efforts that much more difficult. So it's a strategic game. It's something it's around the region. It's a large area, and presenting them with a different look complicates their planning process. But it also provides Australia this intimate knowledge now of U.S. nuclear submarine operations on an increased basis. So your sailors from the Royal Australian Navy are going to have better and more frequent interoperability with the U.S. Navy and the U.K. Navy in terms of nuclear submarine operations and how those things operate differently than a diesel boat.
Now, obviously, all this is done to try and secure peace and stability in the region, to try and dissuade China from any aggression. In the decades to come, in the 3 or 4 decades to come, how much will technology advance, particularly when it comes to perhaps remote-controlled submarines rather than the large, heavily manned submarines that we're talking about now?
Well, there is already large underwater displacement vehicles that are out there that have been worked on by the U.S. Navy and other navies. So this is where we're going, is into unmanned vehicles. And I think with Australia being integrated with the U.S. and the U.K. in this most sensitive of areas in nuclear submarine technology, that you'll be on board and integrated along as we advance in unmanned vehicles, underwater vehicles.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks so much for joining us, Captain James Fanell.
Thank you.
Interesting, wasn't it? Interesting to hear what the Americans get out of this, really, how strategically it's good for America to have nuclear-fueled submarines based to the south, based around Australia and helping to hem in China, if you like, in the East Asian hemisphere. Fascinating stuff indeed.